love, social convention, gender roles, and religion. Charlotte Bronte's most famous novel challenges ideas on all these topics, and we are here to discuss it. I'm Charlene.
And I'm Mike.
And this is Jane Eyre Files. Chapter 24. All is not gold that glitters. Hello, husband.
Hello, provoking puppet.
Oh, okay. So this time I made a little list of the things
That list is not even comprehensive because
no, really, got a lot.
I had a whole list of terms to call you.
But provoking puppet was the best.
Provoking puppet,
and
I like
that is the one that I thought you'd pick, and that's the one that I wanted you to pick.
That's okay because that wasn't my first choice.
See, I written it down. I put a little arrow next to it.
Oh, that's hilarious. I literally kind of looked through a few of them. If the listeners don't know, you know, like I always try to do, there's always a term from the chapter that I would try to address Charlene. It's a term that's used to address Jane. Mm-hmm. And this chapter has no shortage of them. In fact, I wish Charlotte would have saved some of these for subsequent chapters because we get a lot of good ones, such as, are you ready for the list here?
Yes.
Little Tyrant, Bonny Wee Thing, Capricious Witch, A Little Bungler, Malicious Elf, and my second choice after Provoking Puppet, my Mustard Seed.
Oh, I love that one too.
Yeah, I when I was reading it, I was like, oh, Mustard Seed's the way to go. And I'm like, wow, there's another one, and another one, and another one. And when I got to the end, I was like, ooh, Provoking Puppet is pretty funny.
All right. I thought that was a great choice. So.
Why do I feel like in the time that I've known you, you've referred to the term Malicious Elf at some point or another?
I mean, it's entirely possible. I don't remember. I obviously would not call you an elf because you are tall.
As soon as I saw that term, I'm like, I feel like you've used that before in the past. But anyway, this is a fun chapter because it's long, but the majority of it is just the span of it's like three conversations, three random scenes, and it just goes on a lot of back and forth. So for it being long, it reads a little faster because it's a lot of dialogue. Although I found myself having to kind of reread some of it because, again, Charlotte, very eloquent in the way she writes.
Right. That
I was like, okay, what does she mean? Wait, let me see that again.
And I'm sure you're trying to unpack everything that's being said, unpack the emotions, because we are going to dive into that in this chapter.
Yeah, and I feel like this is, there was a lot of footnotes in this chapter, too.
Oh?
And I feel like it was
in your book? In your
yeah,
book?
yeah.
Oh,
I feel like in the last 2 or 3 chapters, it was like, one here, one there. This one was kept repeatedly having a lot of footnotes that I was referring back to. My copy has the footnotes all on the back of the book, so I had to keep looking toward the back. But anyway, let's get right into it. Charlene, give us the Spark Notes summary for Chapter 24.
Preparations for Jane and Rochester's wedding do not run smoothly. Mrs. Fairfax treats Jane coldly because she doesn't realize that Jane was already engaged to Rochester when she allowed him to kiss her. But even after she learns the truth, Mrs. Fairfax maintains her disapproval of the marriage. Jane feels unsettled, almost fearful when Rochester calls her by what will soon be her name, Jane Rochester. Jane explains that everything feels impossibly ideal, like a fairy tale or a daydream. Rochester certainly tries to turn Jane into a Cinderella-like figure. He tells her he will dress her in jewels and in finery, befitting her new social station, at which point Jane becomes terrified and self-protective. She has a premonitory feeling that the wedding will not happen, and she decides to write her uncle, John Eyre, who is in Madeira. Jane reasons that if John Eyre were to make her his heir, her inheritance might put her on more equal footing with Rochester, which would make her feel less uncomfortable about the marriage.
I like how Spark Notes describes Jane as being self-protective.
Oh, well, I guess that's something we could talk about.
Yeah, I found her a lot more self-conscious, self-deprecating, insecure, immature, but self-protective. I thought Spark Notes would not necessarily try to take a side or have an opinion, but that seems like they're defending Jane's actions.
Okay. I mean, I might be a little protective of Jane.
I was going to say, because I had some issues with her in this chapter, but yeah.
Well, I think that first off, when this chapter starts, you get a feeling that Jane is just so happy, and it's wonderful. She says, "Nature must be so gladsome when I was so happy." and another reference to nature mirroring or echoing the story.
Yeah. Love will do that, right? Is that what
absolutely.
It is?
And that's why I really love this chapter. It's just the engagement chapter. It's she's happy. They have this kind of romantic connection that we can finally explore. You know, it's not all good things because Jane has some fears and some issues.
Some? Okay.
So, but it's still a very happy chapter, and it's very, very lovely to read that. You know, for a romance, which, you know, a traditional romance, you want to have them get together and be happy. This is the first time we finally have that.
Yeah, and you know what we haven't gotten in this chapter? What? Any discussion about the third floor.
Oh,
no burning beds.
No. Very ominous.
No strangers who leave the house bleeding.
No. There's no dark mystery, seemingly.
She's not running from the house in a white billowing gown. She's had these feelings stirring for Mr. Rochester for so long, and now that they've finally been returned, requited, you know, you know. But that's why I could not quite understand her behavior in this chapter. Maybe she just didn't know she didn't know what to do.
Wow,
because she wasn't expecting them to be returned. Maybe sometimes it's easier to lust after something you have no chance of getting, because then if you do get them, you're stunned, right? What's the next step? I don't know. I wasn't expecting this to happen, right? So that's kind of what it feels, and then it makes you maybe she's acting a little bit different ways. She's like you said, she's more insecure and stuff like that.
Let's get into it then. I think you're bringing up the idea that, you know, I think when Rochester addresses Jane, that he sees her as a beautiful woman, and he talks to her as if she is a beautiful woman, and Jane seems to really feel uncomfortable about that. And it does seem weird, you know, to my, you know, viewpoint of like, well, Mr. Rochester is in love with you, so obviously he would find you very beautiful. Yeah. So, you know, why are you so self-deprecating or always, you know, feeling like that seems to flare up her insecurity, but not so much about her looks, but about his feelings towards her. I think that it's like, is he self-deluding himself about his feelings if he can't see her for who she is? If that makes sense.
Okay.
That she doesn't feel seen by him in this moment.
All right. I was just baffled because, like you said, the chapter starts off so happy.
Right.
And yet, you know, this is something we're building towards this whole book. Well, at least once we get to Thornfield and the sort of the attraction develops. And I didn't quite understand it. Like why this should have been such a happy moment. And I was looking forward. You look forward to reading it, and you know, I'd already read the book once, and even on the second reading, I find myself going, "What again? Why is she acting like this? Why is she not just letting him compliment her? Why does she have a hard time believing it?" And the only thing I could think is that maybe, you know, she's never had that urge to feel confident in her appearance in her entire life, you know. And I mean, you and I joke about this all the time, is that we never really were lucky in love until we met each other. And so you will call me handsome, I will call you beautiful, and I feel like there's times when I'm just like, me? You really feel that way about me? And it's like, maybe it's because we haven't heard it that many times in our life.
Yeah. I mean, and I think I reciprocate in that way where I feel like, oh, I don't know. Is he actually truthful in his
You are Jane Eyre in this chapter. There's a lot of similarities between Charlene and Jane Eyre in this particular chapter. But yeah, and it's like, and like I said, again, she's would never had anybody showing any affection for her, more or less, not even from family relations.
And I almost think that there's also been a lot of people who have told her that she's not very pretty. You know, we've had a few characters who have said that in this book that we've read, like Bessie. I think at one point she says, "Oh, you're not as fine looking as the other ladies, as Georgiana, but you know, you're very talented," and that you know, she doesn't take it to heart necessarily because she knows the truth, and she feels that that's true, and you can't be mad if it's true.
But it's not. But it's not a matter of true and false. It's opinion. You know what I mean?
It is. That's true.
It's not a fact.
Yeah.
So it's like, you know, that's and what's funny is, if this would have been a 20-year-old man saying all this stuff, you're like, okay, maybe he's just saying this. But this is a nearly 40-year-old man who has experience with all these different women, and that's why I'm saying I can't get past why she has a hard time believing that. And then, as you continue to read page after page in this chapter, I felt like her constant self-deprecation was somewhat unbecoming for a literary heroine. You know, or is it? You read more than I do. I would have thought that these women had a little bit more confidence in themselves, that they're seeking out this man, and when the man finally shows his feelings, okay, that's great. I got him.
Yeah, I guess it's more maybe that Jane feels like, you know, they fell in love for who they are on the inside, where she doesn't necessarily need Rochester to compliment how she looks, because she doesn't really feel that she deserves it. And definitely on one hand, it's very sad for Jane not to want to kind of enjoy this moment, because she has the man that she loves, and he obviously adores her. So why not accept that he sees her in that light of that love? But
like I said, maybe he has finally met his match as well. Like you said, if they're finally connecting on a level that's more than just the physical, why is that so hard for her to believe? And there's a line that I put in my notes that just blew my mind when she was, I think she's conversing with Rochester at one point, and she says, "I like rudeness a great deal better than flattery." And I'm like, just enjoy it.
I know.
Just enjoy. You know, is it something where she just has a problem just experience? Doesn't she say something in this chapter about you're not supposed to experience true happiness?
Yes, or something, she does say that. Yeah, that she doesn't expect it.
So cold and cynical. I feel like.
I mean, that's just her upbringing. You know, that's her experience. So obviously, it would be hard to think that she could be totally happy.
Yeah, and maybe when half your classmates in Lowood die. Yeah. From consumption or whatever it was, right. You know, or tuberculosis.
Her own family doesn't want her.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's hard.
I get it.
It's hard to understand maybe for on our sides, but obviously this is a character that we've been growing with throughout these chapters, so I think it's easy for us to understand things from her point of view.
Yeah. And there's a point early in the chapter where Jane gives a beggar woman and her boy like all of her money, and I think, is that the first time we really have seen Jane showing a charitable side, right?
Yeah, I thought that was funny, because I also get this kind of image of, oh yeah, there's people who come to Thornfield and Jane might see them or might exchange a passing word from them with them. So it kind of changes my viewpoint of like, oh, Jane's so isolated at this house. So it's like, oh, some people do come and she might see them. But yeah, it's very nice that I don't know, I just like to hear that Jane is charitable in this way, where she's just freely giving some money to some beggarly women.
And you'd think it would fit her personality.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
But it just, maybe she's never been in a good enough position to be able to give, right?
That's true.
And I feel like the inequality in their fortune and their class is now starting to become an issue, perhaps.
Oh, true. Yes. I think that, Jane, relating back to the fact that Jane feels that she doesn't physically maybe match up to the standards that Rochester would expect in a potential wife. She also financially doesn't measure up because she is lower class than him. She's his governess. So it's the point of this book, I think, that Jane and Rochester are not completely equal at this stage, and that they're going to have some issues with their marriage going forward. So it's important to establish this in this chapter, so that by the end, then we know when they are more equal that they will be very happy together.
Oh, foreshadowing. There's this.
So Jane feels really uncomfortable with Rochester spending money on her, treating her like this highborn lady when she's not one. And she doesn't expect that. She doesn't want him to spend a lot of money on her. She just wants him to love her and to give each other companionship, I think.
But then I was going to ask you, do you think that Jane is worried that she'll be, discarded like his other paramours that he's been showering with gifts and stuff?
Well, yes, I guess, we're jumping ahead a little bit, but then, when Rochester takes her to go dress shopping and he just wants to buy her a bunch of stuff, she does feel a little bit like she's a part of a harem. She mentions a seraglio, and she doesn't want to be that. She doesn't want to be someone who just, has gifts showered upon them and makes her feel cheap, I guess. So, and perhaps then if she is part of his harem, she will be discarded like his other paramours, like you said.
Yeah. But I wonder, I think she's projecting a little bit. There's only so much she could possibly know.
Yeah, it's just a few dresses. It's fine.
Well, yeah. And then what it got me is that I believe Jane calls him stubborn for wanting her to try on all these wedding dresses. But then I think Jane is the one that's kind of acting a little stubborn. Because, she's the plain Jane and she doesn't want to be showered with these gifts. But at the same time, it's like, if you can't go all out on your wedding day, then when can you? Right? Like, I think
very true. I wouldn't necessarily be like Jane in this instance. If you want to shower me with gifts, Mike, feel free.
Yeah, you're supposed to be able to appreciate it, right? Especially if you're... I know that, again, he's twice your age. He has a bit of money. And yes, it's so virtuous that they love each other for who they really are. But you can let him throw you a bone. Let him... Because I feel like sometimes people... There's that idea that sometimes it's better... It's nice to still receive, They say it's better to give than receive, right?
Yeah.
But it's like, it's okay. Because when you receive a gift... People like the feeling of giving a gift.
Right.
And they're not going to get that enjoyment of giving if the person doesn't want to receive it.
Right, yeah. I guess I could also see Jane's point is that she's not going to be able to give back. So she's just receiving and it feels very one-sided. Sure. She's losing some of that power that she has because she's just... yes.
That's the key.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. So, yeah. Jane is very cynical, I think, in love. Like, I think you mentioned that. But it's her balancing her passion and reason and not wanting to get carried away. She says at one point, quote, "I suppose your love will effervesce in 6 months or less. I have observed in books written by men that period assigned as the farthest to which a husband's ardor extends. Yet, after all, as a friend and companion, I hope never to become quite distasteful to my dear master."
Yeah, I roll my eyes a little bit at that because she says, "Oh, I read it in a book." Oh, and to me, it's like that's what I mentioned before. Her inexperience and her immaturity is only adding to her cynicism. She doesn't have enough life experience to know what it's like. She's just, I saw this somewhere, or I heard about this, rather than had it actually happen to her.
Well, I guess it does come back, I think, to that Spark Notes word that they use, the self-protective, where she does feel that she doesn't quite deserve what Rochester wants to give her. She doesn't feel like, that she doesn't want to be beholden to him for everything. Again, why she writes to her uncle to see if he might leave her some money, I guess. She has to protect her feelings because maybe Rochester is not quite serious. She can't quite believe in her happiness that if he does leave her in 6 months or he doesn't feel quite the same about her, at least she's still her own independent woman,
Yeah.
Yeah, independent women, you love them.
Yeah, we've established that over 2/3 of this book is that she's headstrong and passionate and definitely independent.
And she values her independence.
Yeah, I think I can kind of understand that now. Now that we've talked it out, I can see where she feels a little bit uneasy because of, like you said, because of where she comes from, because she just lost out on a bunch of money from Mrs. Reed's letter.
Oh, well.
We assumed a bunch of money.
From her uncle.
And now it's... Yeah, maybe it is.
And I also wanted to ask you then, now we'll go back to Blanche. So do you think that Rochester using Blanche to make Jane jealous is cruel?
Now that we've had more time and now that he's kind of admitted it, I feel like I didn't mind it if I thought he was truly interested in Blanche, or that he was expected to pursue her because it seemed like, wasn't Mrs. Fairfax saying, "Oh yeah, they're such a great couple."
Yeah, and people are expecting them to get married.
Yeah. But now it does seem kind of mean.
Yes, I do think it is a little mean because Blanche, as a woman, it's unfair to her because she has this expectations in her life where she has to marry well or whatever. But I also think he picked Blanche and he doesn't feel that bad about it because she's superficial and not very nice to the people around her. And he thought that if anyone around her deserved this, then it would be her.
Yeah, that is mean. Like, she's still a person.
I know.
Right?
Yeah.
And are you saying that, like, he didn't go to Blanche until after the fire, right?
Yes.
So you're thinking that it didn't even occur to him?
Like, he wasn't going to go over there and visit for any random reason, no.
Oh, okay. Because I thought it was set up that, like, they'd already known each other and they were sort of expected to be together.
They had known each other before. I imagine that was a couple of years before, and, maybe there was a party or something, and maybe Rochester had entertained the idea of marrying her.
I want to believe so.
But then he's been gone. He left. He's like, no, thank you.
But is he like, so he's like hatching this plot as he's riding at the morning after the fire, riding over to the party?
Yeah. I think he was probably hatching that plot right after Jane left.
If I can just get everyone to come back, and then I'll just lay it on really thick and try to make Jane jealous, huh?
Yes.
Oh, is that how you will appear should I ask a favour? As your wife?
Who talks of favours? I've offered you favours.
But not of my choosing, sir. May I ask one now?
What, you changeling?
There. You are less than civil now, and I like rudeness a great deal better than flattery. This is what I have to ask. Why did you take such pains to make me believe you wish to marry Miss Ingram?
Is that all? Thank God it is no worse. It may make you indignant, Jane. And I've seen what a fire spirit you can be. You positively glowed in the cool moonlight last night when you mutinied against fate and claimed your rank as my equal.
Of course I did. But to the point, Miss Ingram.
I feigned courtship of her because I wished to render you as in love with me as I was with you. I knew jealousy would be my best ally.
Oh, excellent. Now you are small. Not one whit bigger than the end of my little finger. Was it not a burning shame and disgrace? Did you think nothing of Miss Ingram's feelings?
Because she has none, save pride, and that needs humbling.
But at the same time, do you think Blanche should have been suspicious of any kind? Like, did she have any idea that maybe he had, he's got all kinds of other women that he could be with?
Suspicious of Rochester's intentions?
Yeah.
Probably. I don't know. I feel like Blanche would have the kind of ego where she'd expect Rochester to come, because she's so beautiful and talented and well accepted in society. So, no, probably not.
Perhaps she should have been a little more skeptical like Mrs. Fairfax.
Well, Mrs. Fairfax is a little bit of a Debbie Downer in this
totally
in this chapter where she, Rochester finally does tell her that he wants to marry Jane. And Miss Fairfax seems a little bit disturbed by that. I do wonder that, why she wouldn't have seen this coming. She says Rochester seems to have a marked preference for Jane, but I do think maybe status is so important to Mrs. Fairfax that she couldn't possibly imagine that Rochester would marry the governess.
And he probably keeps his feelings a little close to the vest, right?
Yeah, she does seem to find him hard to read. That's true.
Yeah, Mrs. Fairfax is definitely a bit of an enigma in this chapter. Like, I feel like she seems happy for Jane, but at the same time, I don't think she completely accepts their relationship, right?
No.
And then what I found really ironic was that, Jane is very, as we mentioned, there's that word again, self-deprecating. She's very self-deprecating throughout this chapter. But then as soon as Mrs. Fairfax makes any hint that maybe Rochester's not marrying her for the right reasons, then Jane turns on a dime. Like, she gets really defensive. And there's that line where she says, "Am I a monster?" That comes out of nowhere.
Oh, well, I guess, yeah. It does hurt Jane that Mrs. Fairfax should seem so bewildered by Rochester having feelings for her. Whereas, just a moment before, it does seem like Jane is expecting that Rochester doesn't really have feelings for her, I guess. So it is a little weird.
Yeah, but that must be tough because I always thought that Mrs. Fairfax was sort of like a conscience or a mentor or someone that would just be a good listener. And yet, this is probably the happiest news of Jane's life. Yeah. And Fairfax is just kind of
it is
not there, right?
I guess the only thing that I can think is that Mrs. Fairfax is afraid that Rochester maybe doesn't really intend to marry Jane, that he's just going to take advantage of her, and then he's going to say, "Oh, sorry, just kidding." And
then she's going to have to put an ad in the paper for another governess. But,
that hard work, yeah.
For as skeptical as Mrs. Fairfax is, who is happy about their union? Adele.
Oh, yeah. And I think it's really sweet when they have this moment together, Rochester, Jane, and Adele, when they go on the carriage ride to town.
Yeah, but then why do you think that Jane insists on Adele coming with them?
I do feel that it's a direct consequence of Jane's conversation with Mrs. Fairfax, which kind of dampened a little bit of her happiness. Because maybe, even if Jane was feeling a little insecure about, the truth of what's happening, the fact that Mrs. Fairfax is echoing it too made her feel like, oh, maybe Rochester, is just going to treat me like a plaything, or he's not going to listen to me. And then she tries to convince Rochester to bring Adele, and he's like, nope. She's like, oh, I guess I don't have this power over him, and she gets a little sad about it, but then he says, okay, if you really want Adele to come, then she can come. So Jane is a little bit mollified by that. And I do love in this scene where Rochester is kind of framing his meeting with Jane as a fairy tale, which is just it shows Rochester's kind of sense of humor and why maybe Jane really enjoys conversing with him, because he's just such fun to talk to. It
is charming. Like that that really warmed my heart. I'm not gonna, I'll mention a lot of times, we get to the end of these episodes, we always have like a meaningful passage or quote, and I had two in mind, and one of them, my second choice, which I will not have, is sort of that scene.
Oh, okay.
Because it reads really well.
Yes.
And it like I said, it warms your heart because you haven't seen that from him, and yet he's basically saying, in no uncertain terms, the end of the quote, which I love, he says, "We shall leave Earth and make our own heaven yonder."
Yes, and we don't get as much backstory from Rochester, but as happy as we are to see Jane happy, I think we should also be happy that Rochester is experiencing this joy. Yeah,
that's a really good point. But then to bring it all back home, unfortunately, Jane is so grounded in reality that it's unfortunate that she doesn't seem to be able to truly enjoy this moment, especially now that this man that she loves is really, really getting sappy and incredibly romantic.
And again, I think that Jane has to balance reason and passion. She continually does this throughout the book, and Rochester might get carried away romantically, so she just keeps teasing him and frustrating him in the scenes at the end of this chapter. And I think Rochester, I don't know. Do you think he's getting carried away?
I mean, he's definitely laying it on a little thick, but maybe that's his true personality. Like he's finally met that someone who stimulates him in so many more ways than just physical, right?
Right.
He's met his match.
But he loves PDA.
Well, that's true. Is that a man thing, I guess? I don't know. But what's funny is, at the same time, I can totally respect Jane for like sticking to her convictions, but it would be nice to see her unwind a bit, and I don't know, maybe is this what Victorian era women were taught or known to do? It seems
again,
like,
I think that self-protective where, what if Rochester, and her got a little too intimate, and then the wedding didn't happen, and then her virtue is ruined. I don't know if that's what Mrs. Fairfax is afraid of, but Jane has to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, and then I also feel like we've alluded to it a couple times already, but I think Jane seems more interested in holding some sense of power over him.
Right.
And if she accepts these gifts and accepts all these compliments and returns them, then she's not going to be able to have that over him. And
that's true. That's part of her independent nature.
Mm-hmm. So what do we get for interesting context from this chapter?
Well, I wanted to highlight the song that Rochester sings to Jane towards the end of this chapter. It begins, "The truest love that ever heart felt at its kindled core, did through each vein in quickened start the tide of being pour." And it's because this is based on a longer poem that Charlotte Bronte wrote in 1845, which was a couple years after she was in Brussels working at the school that belonged to Monsieur Heger. And that's the married man whom she had a crush on.
If only he knew.
I know.
That Charlotte Bronte wrote a poem about him.
Yes, and I think it's interesting that she kind of reused this poem. I guess she just really loved the cadence of it or something. Because all the passages aren't all the same, but she does kind of rework things. So I pulled a few stanzas from the original poem that she wrote, and I wanted you to read it, Mike, for our listeners.
Oh, okay. Should I read it in my best Michael Jayston voice?
You may try, yes.
Oh, I would never dream of impersonating our dear friend. But, okay, this is from the original poem. The interest seized not with his voice, the homage tracked him near. Obedience was my heart's free choice, whate'er his words severe. His praise unfrequent, favors rare unduly grew, and too much power a haunting fear around his anger threw. His coming was my hope each day, his parting was my pain. The chance that did his steps delay was ice in every vein. Ooh.
Right? Ooh. Powerful.
Yeah.
Very emotional. But yeah, that last stanza that you just read is actually the second stanza in the song that Rochester sings to Jane, just with the words changed to talking about a woman. instead of saying his coming, her coming. So yeah, I think it's kind of funny that she does that. Not twice, 3 times she uses this poem. She also used it in the first novel she wrote called The Professor. And this novel was only published after her death. And it's about a woman falling in love with her professor. So again, echoing her own feelings for Monsieur Heger.
Did Monsieur Heger know about this book?
Yeah, so I also want to mention that I have the full versions of the poems on my website. I don't know if I've ever really plugged my website before, but it's just sort of a way to gather everything that I've kind of learned about Jane Eyre, like adaptations and specific tidbits about what Charlotte wrote about the novel and the characters from her letters. And it's called The Enthusiast's Guide to Jane Eyre. And I have it linked on my Instagram.
Yeah. And then before we go, I will say, what's the last line from that poem?
As I love, loved am I.
And why is that phrase meaningful to Mr. and Mrs. DeKalb, the hosts of this podcast?
Well, I asked Mike if it would be okay to have that line engraved on our wedding rings. So
inside of our wedding rings.
Yes, so it is engraved on our wedding ring.
It's a great story whenever we meet people who are Jane Eyre fans.
Yes, and I really took a long time trying to find a good phrase, and I thought that was perfect for us, wedding rings.
Totally.
Now we've come to the last segment of our podcast where we share our meaningful passage or quote. So, Mike, what did you pick?
As I mentioned earlier, I did have 2 to choose from. And much as I love the phrase where he talks about Jane being a fairy and
yes,
they have their rings of gold or whatever, my quote is actually from the very beginning of the chapter. We talk about how Jane is so happy right off the bat. And I'm always nervous when I'm trying to, sometimes I force myself to try to find a meaningful quote ahead of time so that I can just kind of get it off.
So you can enjoy the rest of the
reading
chapter.
it. And so this one is actually the second paragraph of the chapter, of a 16-page chapter. And I'm glad I got it out of the way soon because I kept thinking, is anything going to top this?
Okay.
And so I'm going to go with my first instinct. And this is Jane, the morning after she's gotten engaged. They've gotten out of the rain. She slept for the night. And she says, quote, "While arranging my hair, I looked at my face in the glass and felt it was no longer plain. There was hope in its aspect and life in its color, and my eyes seemed as if they had beheld the fount of fruition and borrowed beams from the lustrous ripple." It's that idea we talk about where if when you fall in love, everything is just hits differently.
Right.
You normally you get a little bit more confidence when someone tells you that you're attractive.
Clearly Jane did get a little more confidence and then it just went away.
Yeah, what happened? Because it's like she can't say those things. She can think them briefly.
Yeah.
It's all in the subconscious, but then she can't let Rochester pour it on a little bit more. But yeah, so that chapter starts off so promising. Not that the chapter didn't end promising, but it just starts. Some of that skepticism starts to creep in. But I love that first moment where it's just like this is the very first morning after she's gotten engaged, and she's already talking about how, oh my God, I feel so much different, and I feel so much more, again, confident, for lack of a better word. But so then, what was your most meaningful passage from this chapter?
Okay, so you picked a passage from the beginning of the chapter. I actually picked the very last quote from this chapter, where Jane says, "My future husband was becoming to me my whole world, and more than the world, almost my hope of heaven. He stood between me and every thought of religion, as an eclipse intervenes between man and the broad sun. I could not in those days see God for his creature, of whom I had made an idol."
That was one of the close ones that I almost chose
from,
yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's fitting that I should pick it because I really identify with this passage, being a married woman and feeling that, that line, "My future husband was becoming to me my whole world." I think that is a good thing for any married couple. Aww. So I know. I know that this passage kind of is a little bit ominous because, Jane is very religious, and the fact that she is unable to see God for his creature, that's not going to end well for her, I think.
Yeah.
But it also shows their union is a little unequal or skewed. So it's just a little bit of a damper on the joy, but I think I really love the romantic nature of that passage. And it surprises me that it's taken me until recently to be married and to really understand what that means. Yeah. And I love it.
But are you finally able to experience true happiness that Jane says we're not supposed to?
Oh, because we're equals?
Or just that people aren't supposed to have any true happiness?
Oh, well, that's just Jane being a little cynical and pessimistic.
Yeah.
I'm not quite that pessimistic.
Because it's more foreshadowing. Like, what's going to happen next? Well, we're going to have to just find out. But
yes.
Yeah. But I at least want to be able to enjoy this chapter for what it is. And so, before we move on,
it's their moment of happiness.
Yeah, however fleeting.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. This really helps us grow and reach new listeners. If you want to talk Jane Eyre with me online, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at AirGuide. That's EYRE.
And if you want to hear more from me, I host my own podcast called Out of Touchstone, where my good friend Chad and I discuss all the films that Disney produced for their Touchstone Pictures label. You can also find me on Twitter at Mike DeKalb.
Thank you, and farewell for the present.